Alright, good morning. My name is Mario Anthony Caceres, and my main claim that I will be refuting today is that adding educational rights to the Constitution will improve the American education system. The two supporting claims that were given were that American education suffers from a lack of government support, and that when government support is constitutionally required, systems are improved. Let's start with the first supporting claim. American education suffers from the lack of government support. Though David did use the Reauthorized Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, known as the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, in order to provide a base of government support, David fails to understand that education is a responsibility of the state. At the federal level, the No Child Left Behind Act, according to the U.S. Department of Education, only provides funding for standardized testing, highly qualified teachers according to each state's standards, requires that the state sets one high challenging standard, and requires schools to provide contact information to military recruiters. In order to qualify for funding for low-income areas, these schools must meet certain criteria to receive the aid. Though he is correct that there is a lack of support at the federal level, it is the state that is responsible over the education quality, direction, and changes in order to limit our government and give the autonomy to the state government. Although educational rights are not part of the U.S. Constitution, each state provides an education provision in its own constitution, meaning that each state gives its own rights to an education, has its own standards in education, and gives its own opinion in what a quality teacher is. When we move on to our second supporting claim, when government support is constitutionally required, systems are improved, we looked at the learning curve, and basically he points out that many of these countries have educational rights either in their constitution or have some sort of form of it within its government. And though that this is the case, the state, our own 50 states have educational rights within their own constitutions, making it somewhat of an equal standard. David does mention Finland and North and South Korea as examples of countries which have been ranked highly in the scale that have educational rights in its constitutions, but overlooks a number of possibilities as to why they are there. Both share the trait in which education is highly valued, but have much different attitudes towards the idea. Economic factors, social issues, and cultural values may be in question. According to Andres Schiedler, in his TED Talk, Use Data to Build Better Schools, South Korea has been known to be a country whose cultural progression is driven by hard work. This model has been instilled and has conditioned its people into higher expectations. On the other end, Finland has a much different approach, where learning is done outside with self and personal interests in mind. Time in the classroom is very, very limited. When we look at education through economic means, for example, the small country of El Salvador in Central America, they too have educational rights written into their constitution under Article 56 of its constitution. It protects the right to an education. It states all inhabitants of the republic have the right and the duty to receive a simple and basic education that will train them to perform as useful citizens. The state shall promote the formation of special education centers. When imparted by the state, simple, basic, and special education shall be free. However, after 12 years of civil war, the country has been stricken by violence and poverty. Due to these circumstances, many children go into the workforce at a young age, having never completed their own basic education. In conclusion, though I agree that there must be improvements in the American education system, I do not believe it will be solved through the implementation of educational rights into the U.S. Constitution. How will it truly help the culture? How will it truly help a culture that already established a set idea of what education is, and how will it change the attitude towards education? By studying each country's unique cultures and models, and laws, we can learn about what might be the right system for the United States.
All right, the structural stuff is good, very solid. You're doing exactly what you need to do. I hope everybody remembers this when we get to the debates, because you need to do the same kind of thing. You're following a series of arguments that you just heard, and so if you can keep track of it and say, the advocate's second argument was this, and here are my responses, it makes the debate so much clearer. So let's try and keep this habit up. Everybody is doing the right thing so far, and I really appreciate that. So structurally, everything's good. I like the analysis that you had on the first point. I do think you need a little bit more information about the state's responsibility, that it being constitutional. And you can use California as an example. You say, where in the California Constitution doesn't mention education is article whatever it happens to be, and we've got all these amendments that talk about those sorts of things. So that's why it's not the federal Constitution, because it's a state obligation. Every state has something like this in their Constitution, and here's an example that proves that sort of thing. So the idea that we don't take it seriously, or we don't give it a priority because it's not in the Constitution, that seems to be a little bit artificial. I also think you miss an opportunity to make a good, strong argument here, talking about spending. How much spending is there on education? I mean, in California, it's a requirement that half of the budget, or almost half of the budget, goes to education in the state. Well, so we've got a budget in California of $100 billion. It's actually more than that now, but let's say $100 billion. That's $50 billion that's going to elementary schools, high schools, community colleges, state universities, the UC system, all that stuff. That's a lot of money, and it goes up every year. Why does anybody think that we are not emphasizing education enough? The only evidence that the advocate presents that says that we're not emphasizing education enough is that our student performance is not where it could be, or something like that. I don't remember exactly what their argument was. Wasn't it something like that? Yeah. So so the real question is, what is the cause of this problem? And the advocate's identifying an absence of constitutional provision for that. And then on your second point, I think when you talk about that, you've got good answers. Look, there's a substantial difference between these places that accounts for their differences in the way they educate. It's got little to do with their constitution and everything to do with their culture and the way they approach these things. And at the end, I really like that kind of summary that you have about, why do some things work, why do some things not work. What we need is to find things that are individualized and work for people. That's what we need to be working on. And there's your point. It's that the answer is not in making the 28th Amendment that gives education a constitutional right to Americans. That's not going to change any teacher in a classroom. That's not going to change any spending. It doesn't change children and their behavior in the classroom. It doesn't change the culture of the students in any of that situations. This is not the kind of relationship that you're getting. And how do we know that? Well, El Salvador has it in their constitution, and they got all kinds of things that have screwed them up and made this impossible to happen. We don't have those kinds of things. We have different kinds of problems. And so the real source of the problem, we need to be looking at what those real sources are. I like that argument. I think that's a good causality argument that you've got there at the end. And I just think you could elaborate a little bit more on it. But I thought that you found the right issues to talk about. I thought that you did a pretty good job documenting them. You kind of get sidetracked in the No Child Left Behind because you describe what the law is and what all those things are. But how does that show that it shows that the federal government is involved to some degree, all right, but it's mostly, supplemental funding, because the responsibility is the state responsibility, and that's where I thought you needed a little bit more documentation. All right, thank you.